Nah, I think we're live. Should be anyway. Should be confirmed any moment now that you can hear me and such. See me. Confirmed. It's confirmed enough. All right. So, process. Sort of an important thing. And I do it poorly. Concession made right from the start. So I will try to do it better. And encourage broader participation and try to reduce my unnecessary negatives. Now, some of them I can't change. I'm not going to comb my hair or put it in ponytails or do whatever. Some people would paint on some mustaches or something. No, I'm not going to do all that stuff. And I'm not going to be sarcastic. Yes, I'm still going to be sarcastic. And I'll just try not to be gratuitously so, and such. So anyway, so that's part of process, the process of making videos. Now, much of what is dependent on the process of doing physics is apparently doing the process of communication, because you're not really just performing the art of physics, demonstrating. You have to demonstrate it in a atmosphere where you can show the opposing position to be inferior. So you need to do comparisons. And those comparisons in some respects need to be interactively challenged. That is, you can't just argue with the dead. You have to sort of argue with people that can argue back. To do it really correctly, I think. I think that's really how people can become educated, is to make comparisons between things and point out how, when you compare them, one of them shines truer, kind of thing. Something like that. So I think that's part of the process that needs to take place. Just part of it. I guess this also just gets to the point of the fact that you really do have to, people have such a hero worship problem. Their favorite player can do no wrong. Their world's against them. That kind of nonsense. Their perceptions are so biased that you really can't get to revealing the truth until you first reveal the true weaknesses, limitations, and flaws of their heroes. So that has to be part of it, in the sense that that's part of the competition thing, part of the beating them right on the court. Anyway, so in that context, I have written this little bit of stuff just to try to make as simple as possible a conversation about the complexity of persuasion, of argumentation, of evidence, of how we interact, and what our obligations are in those interactions in terms of having any right to claim we've made a sufficient claim. So this idea of these connected words, truth, value, seems like a nice concept, that what we're really after in measuring any statement is measuring its truth value. That is, how much integrity it has as a truth. So if I say something like water is wet, I can defend that truth pretty substantially by pointing out that the word wet was, in all probability, likely invented to describe what water is, so that there's such a direct connection that you can say, in a sense, that it's an absolute truth, that yes, water must be wet, because the word wet wouldn't have occurred to us if we didn't have water as the example of what a wet was. So it's a solid truth that maybe, I'm sure there'll be some crazy dissidents somewhere on Earth, but something you could get everybody to say, yeah, that sort of makes sense. I don't think the word wet came from some other idea. Like people weren't dunking themselves in mercury and going, "Ooh, that feels wet." I don't think that was happening. And so it seems kind of like this is sort of an obvious thing. You know, your rain, you get wet. And there's this concept of wetness. And yeah, that all makes very good sense. I don't think anybody could really dispute it and say, no, Martians invented the word wet, or wet came here on a meteor, or some other kind of wacky theory. Very few people will protest establishing it as a truth. Water is wet. Very good truth, high truth value, you could say. Now, we get into all these other words. Water is slippery. Well, now maybe we could have an argument, because slippery would have to do with mud and, you know, different forms of wet combined with something else. And, you know, banana peels, you don't even really think of them as watery, you know, and then they're slippery. Clearly there can be examples where slippery wouldn't, you know, not as high a truth value. That certainly all the rational people would agree that, you know, water creates slipperiness, generally speaking, but they wouldn't be as high a truth value. So anyway, I'm just, you know, so this idea that there's a quality to a claim, I think is a reasonable way to state this, and that we all we can base it on is these examples of how you can tie it to other reliable truths. So the point would be is that once you've established some definitions for this word wet, then you can sort of demonstrate how other substances might perform in the same way, and they might create the same effects, and they might create evaporation and different things that were similar to what water did when it wetted you. And these would just build more and more of these high value truths by demonstrating, you know, by throwing a bucket of this stuff on you, and you'll say, yes, that does feel very much like wet. That kind of thing. That's all we can do. So that's the thing we're after, is high value descriptions, statements, claims. So, and then the rest of the new claims we just put into that bucket. And as the last thing says, by logic, you're just testing the compatibility with these other already tested truth claims. So you're just taking the other tested truth claims and just saying, how well does it fit with those? And if there's not any incompatibility, then it has a chance to become a high valued claim. Now, having high value still requires you to have more than just a non-incompatibility with some other test or demonstration. Like if I said steel is wet, somebody could argue that, no, I have an experiment where steel doesn't do anything like being wet. Okay, the only wetness is the blood that pours out of you when you put the steel on your head. No wetness effect really directly at all. And, you know, when it's molten, that test is just we can never really perform that test correctly because all of the test subjects don't seem to know what the function is at all. They seem completely distracted by something else. You pour the steel on them and they sit there and run around hysterically doing shit. You know, we can't even get their, does it feel wet? And they never even answer our questions. So yeah, we have had a hard time doing that experiment. But anyway, so I'm just saying that this is the process. This is what we're stuck with, is we have to communicate why something is a quality statement based on this argumentation that'll contain in it why it's consistent with what we know and the experiments that have been done, the demonstrative. You know, it's been shown by experiment. And so experiment would be just a form of evidence. So the evidence is in the form of experiments, demonstrations. We can just perform it right here in front of you, show you how it happens. And then part of the evidence would be its compatibility with the other facts, the way we use words, definitions. And last thing you're left with in terms of this evidence is two aspects: how strong the evidence is, say DNA versus fingerprints versus an odor left behind versus, let's say, footprints. All different things that we know could be faked. They have different degrees of fraud might be possible. Kind of easy to do footprints, right? A little harder to do fake fingerprints, but not impossible. A little harder to do fake DNA, but not impossible. All that kind of stuff. And so it all has different quality. And then the bottom line would be quantity. If you have footprints and fingerprints and DNA, then you have to start figuring out that, well, the only way this could just be a setup is somebody would have to have access to all of those things and have to procure them all in some secretive manner, and then have placed them in the crime scene in some way so perfectly that they duplicate the real thing. And so you're still stuck with the fact that there could be a catch. And unfortunately, everybody's the wrong word, a very large percentage of people will cling to any catch that they can. If it's their father on trial, it's their hero, it's their preference, their magical unicorn is going to be torn down, and they don't want that to happen. And so they'll cling to any catch that might indicate that, no, it's a setup, it's a game is rigged, the government did it, it's an inside job, some sort of bullshit. And that you can't do much about. All you can do is argue, please, come on, let's be rational, right? Let's be fair to our intelligence and its capacity to function, and let's not play this hypocritical game where I'm going to treat the evidence differently when it's accusing me, and then when it's accusing somebody I hate. I'll have a different standard for what evidence looks like. And we all should be able to admit, let's call each other out on that bullshit. As soon as somebody's doing that, let's call each other out. Let's be fair to the evidence. Let's not be quote mining the crime scene to try to make him guilty, instead of him. And I would argue that much of that happens especially in this physics conversation, where the people sitting in the established chairs have gotten very comfortable in their chairs and in their ivory tower, and they are often desperate to stay there, and so they use way excessive language to imply that they have nothing to account for. There's no weaknesses in their story. It's the most confirmed equation in the history of mankind. It's the most, they'll just preposterous exaggerations. It predicted more stuff than anything ever predicted and ever. It's the greatest crystal ball ever. All this, just stories, because they want to stay in their chair. They don't want to have to they don't have to earn it. And they don't have to admit the ugly truth, which is they're sitting on something easily toppled. Very weak foundation. Very muddy. Got too much water in it. Too much bad facts. Things that are just stated as facts when they're not really facts. Like, there's this huge correlation between water waves and photons interacting with matter. It's not really a huge correlation. That kind of thing. All right, so this was something I just wanted to get to in terms of recognizing that it's really not that complicated. We're just going to attempt to challenge each other's understanding. Now, ideally, what I need is somebody who believes in a sincere way that conventional physics did a diligent job testing the evidence to draw their conclusions, that Copenhagen wasn't just a moment of chance, where a bunch of physicists just happened to be having a meeting and they just happened to start talking some BS, and all of a sudden that BS got written in stone and called the Copenhagen. Because that's where they were. And all of a sudden, physics took a turn, and it just kept going that way. And the turn was just so incidental and didn't really have to do with any hard evaluation of whether or not we should start opening the door to, this magical probability physics where, some other magical force besides the material objects in the experiment are deciding what's happening, that there's a probability god, okay, that's saying, yes, I'm not going to allow you to do anything, but I'll give you 16 choices, and I'll mix those up randomly somehow, not by mechanical process, just by the magic of the universe. That's, you could argue, in explaining these historical events, these, you could just point out that this is an awful lot riding on a terribly uninteresting pivot. I could say that about the Young experiment. Nothing really dramatic revealed by Young. It's just that people really hadn't talked about it for 100 years, so they sort of forgot that Newton's rings existed, and that these phenomenons, especially of light diffraction off of surfaces, especially dirty surfaces, was something that Newton had played with a lot. And this was a real phenomenon that nobody had a good explanation for. And they've kind of forgot. So Young shows up 100 years later and does some experiments. All of a sudden, there's, we got, two slits. Well, that's two photon splits in two and goes through both, and blah, blah, all these things that if they use that theory and apply it to these other circumstances, they're going to get into trouble, but they're not really thinking about the other circumstances. So they've just got their eyes focused on this two slit thing. So they come up with a theory that really can't be bent, to fit these other circumstances. And it's really not a very thoughtful description of reality. Not good enough. All right, then I can argue about Einstein's relativity is the same sort of like little incidental things. He writes these papers, thinking to himself that this is an interesting catch. I mean, you can do it this way, and it sort of fits. Now, he knew it had some limitations, but he says, what the hell? These correlations seem, reasonable we observe them. So why not go with them and see where they go? But in that process, it became an all or nothing again. There has to be a winner and there has to be a loser. So Bohr and Einstein turned this into some competition, between a physical reality and a metaphysical reality. And the irony is that Einstein's mechanism is fairly metaphysical. And so it just confuses the whole issue of what we're really debating and who should be winning the debate. And then, Einstein demonstrates the photoelectric effect, explains it, and, in a very mechanical way. So points for his side. So it just is a little bit of a snowball. And so you have a simple kind of argument. You have gravity, which can be explained as a, perpetual vacuum cleaner, but that doesn't really, there's no mechanism. That's not really physics when you make invisible vacuum cleaners. And then you connect time to it, because you can say, look, time also does something weird. But that weirdness is just connected really to velocity, and they ended up connecting it to acceleration in gravity, as if acceleration in gravity was different than any other acceleration, which it isn't. By Einstein's own theory, it's force. So the forces that push things, I could hit this with a bullet. I could hit it with this pen. I could hit it with my finger. There's all forces being converted through mechanisms. I mean, it's hard to see the force when we use our finger, just because it's a lot of complex Rube Goldberg stuff from brain all the way through arm, nerve to do the forcing. It's so disconnected from an obvious force, but it's still just a physical force. It's still just physical magnetic movement of little bits that are repelling each other or attracting each other, and that's the interaction. But it's a real thing in all these other cases, except now gravity is turned into this weird space-time dimensional thing that somehow is being sucked out of the universe, when the a more rational description of a simple correlation between velocity and the fact that everything that has velocity that's doing a timed cycle, that is everything that has a cycle in it, like decaying atoms, that cycle you can rationally understand might change if the object is being moved. That is, movement takes time. So if you're doing something like this and you have to move, you won't be doing this as fast because the up and the down have to now travel a longer distance. And it can't do it in the same time because it can't go any faster. So you could sort of understand if I'm going up and down, I can go up down much faster if I don't move. If I move, up and down gets slower because I can't go faster. So if I have to go at constant speed and then somebody makes me move sideways, you can understand the lines get much longer. It takes a lot longer for the ticks to happen. So the clock ticks slower. Now, there's nothing, you don't need to bend a dimension to understand how every mechanical system, including atoms, would be vulnerable to being disturbed by being obligated to move. That movement would break the clock. And there's no time dimension that's being broken, just clocks being broken. All right, so yeah, I didn't want to really get into a whole long relativity thing. And I really wanted to get to the more pertinent point, which is we have an explanation for gravity. So because of this time dilation association, when we say, oh, GPS proves it, and this proves it, every time we find a muon that doesn't decay as fast, and we say we proved that there's bent space, and that bent space is causing gravity. No, all you've proved is a relationship between velocity and the decay, the atomic decay taking longer. The molecular process takes longer when something's moving. That's all you have. That's all you've proven. You haven't proven the existence of the non-gravity particles. You haven't proven that gravity is not a force. You haven't proven that there's some space thing that can be bent. There's some ether bent or some space bent or some thing bent in some way that causes a convergence of matter that doesn't require any energy. Well, I've already made these arguments repeatedly, so I just don't know if I want to be this redundant. I mean, I've already pointed out how there's no energy in bent space gravity. Space-time is a bad answer because there's no energy in it. Virtual photons to explain magnetism is a bad answer because it has no origin. There's no energy to make the photons, and there's no explanation of how the photons actually convert into movement. So even if you gave them energy sufficient to cause the dramatic effect of magnetism, and how do you make the excretion of a virtual photon cause attraction? It doesn't make much sense. An outward force create an attractive force. So without more character, that description can't possibly be the right answer. And it's certainly missing the character of where did the photons come from. So I've given you an explanation for magnetism where it explains that, oh yeah, the photons came from the same place the energy for gravity came from. It's gravity. It's a pressure, a particle pressure. And it's perfectly consistent with all of the observed data, evidence, experiments, all that stuff. It's consistent with all of it. All right. So this conversation shouldn't be hard to have. There shouldn't be any reason why this can't take place, and it just be pointed out that the people who defend the established theory defend the fact that the evidence isn't strong. There isn't a huge quantity of it, and the quality of it is very marginal. I mean, a relationship between velocity and clocks breaking certainly doesn't prove time as a dimension. It's certainly not enough proof. It's It's a footprint. Okay, it looks like a human footprint, but that's about all it is. It's not much evidence of this more detailed claim being made about this much more complex entire system. It's just evidence of one little peculiar fact of the universe, and it doesn't prove this much bigger story they're telling. It's like finding a red scarf and saying that proves Little Red Riding Hood exists. That's a huge leap. That's taking a tiny bit of evidence and constructing way too much theory out of it. And then making a claim that you've proven. And you have a right to say this is the truth, and only reasonable people believe this. And there's no reasonable reason to doubt this, and this is a perfect story, and this explains everything, when, it's a religion. It's got too many invisible men in it, dark matter, dark energy, neutrinos, all kinds of little magical bits that mortal men aren't allowed to see or understand. And they do all kinds of magical things that just happen to be incredibly convenient in terms of they fix mathematical errors. They make other theories like lensing of light by gravity, where the evidence is really, again, incredibly weak. You don't see it where you should be seeing it. You don't see enough of it where you should be seeing it. I mean, it's almost laughable for me to say, I have a lens and it lets me see the printing on this pen really well, okay? But it doesn't create any other images, no other blobs. So everything else that should be a blob or a blur, none of that stuff somehow gets in the lens. Only stuff I get to read is in the lens. So somehow the lens knows when everything else is not focused, and it doesn't allow that blob of light to show up. Because you'll see that in a regular lens, especially a lens the right shape, which is the opposite shape of this lens. You get a lot of aberrant light that creates blobs. You don't see that in space. So there's a great deal of evidence to claim that their assumptions about what's taking place are incorrect. And I've pointed this out with the lensing argument. First, you have Einstein saying, of all the particles in the universe, photons are exempt from the inverse square law when it comes to gravity. So photons feel more gravity. So the fastest thing moving in the universe somehow is affected more by gravity, not less. So the thing moving through the gravity the fastest is bent the most. Now, intuitively, that doesn't sound right, right? Of all the things in the universe to be more affected by gravity, it seems like the photon should be the least affected by gravity, not the most affected. So that sounds a little suspicious. And then when you look at the lens shape, and the fact that you can't really do the Einstein rings. Can't do Einstein rings with a lens the wrong shape, because it can't do the distance part. It can only do one single row of photons. So the ring would be impossible to see because it would only be one row of photons thick. So you'd never see the ring. Because to make the whole ring visible, or more a ring visible, a thicker ring visible, it has to bend all the light towards a focus. This lens does that. A gravity lens bends the light the wrong way. It doesn't bend it to a focus. Can't be used as a focusing lens from anything at a distance right behind it. It can't do it. So I made these arguments. So I won't continue. Well, I probably will continue to make them. They're good arguments, pointing out why their evidence is weak. We're entitled to interrogate them. The people who are obnoxious here, who show up and just do this horrible, obnoxious thing, treat people like crap because they have an argument to make and would like the fair opportunity to make the argument. And, they don't account for anything. You point out, you ask the questions. I have question videos on the channel page. There's some questions about the two-slit experiment and the interferometer and the defects in the evidence for lensing. Those questions are asked. They don't think they have any obligation to answer them. So you find defects and they have no obligation to explain why the defects aren't relevant. And that's the minimum. They should at least point out how it's not relevant that our theory is defective. That what we say an interferometer is doing can't be what it's theoretically impossible. It's irrelevant that it's theoretically impossible for the wrong shaped lens to do what they claim this lens is doing, the gravity lens. They should at least have to say that overtly. But I don't even get that. And I'm entitled to it, my opinion. And all you people who think I'm not entitled, who think somehow I've crossed some line I'm not allowed to cross in finding fault. And again, I found fault when I was 11 years old. I mean, their story always had flaws in it. It was always, this can't quite be right. I mean, the simplest thing in the universe is doing this complex thing of moving in two different fields in two different ways. There's no evidence of these fields. There's no evidence of this ether, this mush that stuff does this sine wave through. How do you even move as a sine wave through anything? Even that doesn't make much sense. So, these are legitimate questions. All right, so that's probably enough. Give you a chance to add a comment if you have any, and call it a day. But I'm just saying that there's got to be some sort of mechanism where this fair test happens, and where cowardice is revealed and demonstrated overtly, and so we can all see it and recognize, they're running away. It's right there, quite obvious. Even though they're being offered money, they still are running away. Why are they running away? These are reasonable questions to ask, because you have to judge the source. So that was part of the reason why this came up, was the Bob guy from the Chappelle Natural Philosophy Society, or whatever the hell organization. And all of these claims, all of these unsubstantiated BS claims, and his persistence. And just, again, you call him on one of his stories, and he'll show up a few days later and start telling the same story again. I mean, it's just that bad. In the other couple of videos I didn't play, he claims he and other people or whatever, he was using some sort of I don't know, muon radiation device to cure cancer, and they cured thousands of people out of 1,000 people. They cured 990, and they're totally successful, and the government shut them down. And then he claims that he's got some life detector instrument, and it can test your life vitality. It does all this stuff, and the guy who invented it or was making saving people's lives with it was thrown in jail. He says he was thrown in jail by the FDA. I mean, bizarre claims. And yeah, that's the reliability of a source. Where's and all these sources have to man up. So when you call a physicist and he starts talking about the two slit experiment and saying things like, well, see, when you open one of the slits, all the photons just pile up over here. When, a high school student could know that's not true. That's not how the experiment actually works. And that the experiment they describe, we had detectors and blah, blah, blah. None of that stuff ever happened. The experiments never even took place. You got to wonder about the quality of the source, what they're claiming. And even that gets to evidence too, because, although I certainly believe that muons decay slower, the trick is the evidence for it isn't great. The only way they can detect these things is to put mountains of bricks on top of the detector. So when they change the detector from on top of the mountain to sea level, they just reduce the number of bricks. You're sort of saying, well, isn't that going to, what if your calculation about how many bricks worth of atmosphere you've lowered, what if your calculation is wrong? It's, the experiment is owned. If you make that calculation incorrectly, then you can confirm you can break the experiment just by adding or subtracting bricks. And, that's again, reason for somebody not to think that it's exactly a high value truth. It's got some value, but it's not really high value because it is dependent on you believing that they can tell how many bricks equals 400 feet of atmosphere. Anyway. The more you pick at this stuff, the more you find weaknesses. Weaknesses that aren't admitted. Physics really doesn't have the character to man up and say, yes, we're really riding on thin ice. We're skating on very thin ice. We haven't really established any of these fundamental truths to be true at all. And we're just claiming they are. And we're doing our we win dance. We found it. We found gravitational waves, even though the theory on its face has some gigantic flaws. Weaknesses, let's call them. So, yes, so I'm going to continue to assert, and maybe I'll do that even more boldly. I mean, maybe I'll change the name of this channel to I'm fucking smarter than all you assholes. Well, I wasn't going to do any swearing. Okay, never mind that. Smartest man in the world. Maybe I'll make the challenge even greater to you people to come up with any evidence, because your evidence is so weak now. I mean, all you have is personal attacks and preposterous mischaracterizations of what I've said. So, I mean, that's part of the reason why I'm putting all this stuff in written words that I can put into maybe even little slideshows, and maybe they just run constantly in these videos to point out that these are the assertions I'm making, and that the garbage these liars put in my mouth have nothing to do with what I'm arguing or how I've argued it. So anyway, so yes, so this is all important stuff. So anyway, I'm thinking this is kind of an easy, simple way to look at it. We're seeking truth. We're seeking statements that have a high quality of truth value, lots of truth value mass, if you want to look at it that way. And how do you make these claims more massive in their truth value? You do it with evidence and demonstrations, and by having lots of compatibility with other facts. And that should be one indication to you, again, that the standard model has some real issues, is the very fact that they have this huge, bizarre divergence in mechanics for quantum mechanics and relativity. Gravity, same speed force, behaves very much like magnetism, at least in the attractive way. It's something that moves things. Magnets move things. Very similar mechanisms, yet completely different explanations of mechanics. And that should be sort of a giveaway that, maybe they're not on the right track. And maybe you people should take some accountability for being part of a process that might force them onto a right track, rather than just being bandwagon riders saying, I trust the nerds with the slide rules. I think the universe is a mathematical equation. It's not a physical mechanism. I think I can better understand a round wheel by writing you an equation of 3 pi r squared d or something, and somehow that gives you understand now why round wheels work. when I think if I just show you a round wheel, I show you rolling, that you'll understand why it works. And especially if I compare it to a square wheel, you'll really get it. If you look at the two equations, I don't think those equations are going to tell you how bad the square wheel is at rolling and how good the round wheel is at rolling. I think you know that. I think you should know that. The physical universe is not mathematics. It's structure. Mathematics explains structure. It describes it formulaically, but it does not illustrate it. Okay, that'll be enough. All right, so we'll see if there's any comments, and then we'll just wait a minute or two. It's the afternoon. Really should be more people here, but maybe there aren't. Let's see what we got. 8. That's pretty pitiful. So that has to change, and I don't know exactly how to make it change yet. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens, I guess. I really hate having to, I don't like doing unsolicited interactions with people. I don't like obliging, forcing issues, but I guess I have to do some of that. I don't know what form to do it in exactly. I mean, you can't just humiliate these people into showing up. You do actually have to snooker them, I suppose. I think you have to bribe them, but we'll see. I haven't even been able to successfully do that yet, so I don't know what the magic is. But I'll have to keep working at it. That's the old text. I still haven't killed that. Funny. Still floating around. All right. So a couple more minutes, and that's it. No point in dragging it out. So if you have any useful rephrasing of statements regarding my descriptions of how we evaluate truths and how the process of measuring quality, or you have something to say regarding the simple statements I've made regarding an alternative explanation that is perfectly consistent with the evidence, and that this simple mechanical process can in fact create all the complexity in the universe without the need of any Heisenbergs and Huygenses and neutrinos, and dark matter, all that. You don't need any event space, virtual photons, don't need any of that stuff. Then yes, post a comment relevant to the subject of the video. Thank you. If you have some challenge, if you can muster one, a link to a video that you say is the truth, that demonstrates some truth that's important, does it in a very good way. Something you say, I can't demonstrate the weakness in this great, perfect argument. Something like that. No, anyway, till the next time and such. Wow, I keep going the wrong place. It's over here. Stupid. Anyway, till next time.